All right, let's dive straight in. Today, we're undertaking a deep dive into a subject that is, frankly, terrifying, but really important to understand. The stark realities of nuclear war. We're going to try and get a shortcut, to being well-informed on this. We'll be guided by the work of investigative journalist Annie Jacobsen, specifically drawing from her recent interviews discussing her book, Nuclear War, a Scenario.
That's right. And Jacobsen's book, it lays out this hypothetical future situation, but the chilling part, every single element of that scenario, how the systems work, the timelines, the consequences, it's all grounded entirely in factual reporting.
Actual reporting based on her interviews, right?
Exactly. Interviews with the actual people who've designed these systems, managed them, lived with them for decades.
And to really set the scale, just right from the start.
Yeah.
Let's put one number on the table. This isn't even from Jacobsen's specific scenario, but from climate modeling scientists published in Nature Food magazine.
Okay, what's the number?
They project that a full-scale nuclear exchange, say between the U.S. and Russia, will likely kill some 5 billion people.
5 billion.
Yeah. And that figure, it comes mainly from the consequences of nuclear winter, which I know we'll get into. But 5 billion, it just immediately tells you this is unlike anything humanity has ever conceived of.
It really does. It fundamentally shifts the conversation, doesn't it? From just national security to something existential. This isn't about winning a war or defeating an enemy. It's potentially about ending civilization as we know it.
Okay, so let's step into the scenario Jacobsen walks through in her book. It kicks off with a specific trigger event.
She begins with a launch from North Korea.
And is that considered a likely starting point by experts?
Well, many she spoke with seem to think so, yes. It's deemed plausible, according to sources like Richard Garwin, who, amazingly drew the actual plans for the very first thermonuclear bomb, Ivy Mike, way back in the 50s.
Wow.
North Korea is currently seen as one of the most dangerous nations globally when it comes to nuclear weapons.
Garwin, just 24 years old, designing something like that. Did you talk more about him?
She did. She mentioned asking him about that moment, drawing up those plans. Apparently, after a long pause, he just told her he wished they hadn't needed to be drawn.
Oof. That puts a heavy perspective on it right from the start, from someone who was right there.
A deep regret, it sounds like, from one of the key figures.
So, in this scenario, once that launch happens, how fast does everything unfold?
Incredibly fast. The entire initial exchange, the core part of the scenario, happens in just 72 minutes.
72 minutes.
Yeah. Jacobsen breaks it down into 3 24-minute acts, and the satellites, they see the launch in under 1 second.
Less than a second. The instant it leaves the silo, the clock is ticking at this almost unbelievable speed. Okay, before we get into that 72-minute timeline, let's try to wrap our heads around the sheer power we're talking about. We hear nuclear bomb, but the difference between, say, Hiroshima, which was horrifying, 15 kilotons, and these thermonuclear weapons, like Ivy Mike, 10.4 megatons. What does that mean on the ground?
It's a massive leap, like exponentially bigger.
Yeah.
To give you some perspective, that Ivy Mike bomb, the 10.4 megaton one Garwin helped design, it used an atomic bomb, basically Hiroshima size, just as the trigger.
Just the trigger.
Yeah, just to set off the much, much larger fusion reaction. That's the kind of scale we're dealing with today.
An atomic bomb as a detonator, that's horrifying. So if one of these, say a 1 megaton weapon, hits a major city, what physically happens? Describe the immediate effects based on the sources.
Okay, well, first you have the flash, intense heat. The fireball from a 1 megaton bomb reaches temperatures like 180 million degrees.
Million degrees.
Sources describe it as being maybe 19 football fields wide. Within that radius, nothing left, just vaporized.
Vaporized. Buildings, people, roads, everything.
Everything. Then comes the blast wave. It pushes out like a gigantic bulldozer, winds at several hundred miles per hour.
It's flattening everything.
Right, leveling buildings, bridges for maybe 6 to 10 miles out. It creates these rubble fields potentially 30 feet deep.
And the heat must cause fires everywhere, right?
Oh, absolutely. That initial flash ignites megafires. Within minutes, maybe hours, you could have a radius of fires spreading out 100 miles from ground zero. Not just small fires, but a firestorm.
100 miles. And what about the direct effects on people caught near the blast, but not vaporized?
Well, catastrophic burns. 3rd, even 4th degree burns for anyone exposed who somehow wasn't killed instantly. Sources even mention the sheer force of the wind miles away, potentially ripping skin off people.
God. And the mushroom cloud, the image we all know. What actually is that?
It's essentially the remnants of combusting carbon, from buildings, trees, the ground, and yes, tragically, that includes the carbon that was people.
That detail is profoundly disturbing. So in this nightmare scenario, if anyone somehow survives the initial blast, the heat, the fires, is there any hope, any organized response? Rescue? Aid?
This is where the sources Jacobsen talked to paint a really, really bleak picture. She interviewed Craig Fugate, the former head of FEMA.
Right, the Disaster Response Agency.
Exactly. His assessment was stark, blunt. He said, in a nuclear strike like this, there is no population protection planning.
No planning at all.
His reason was chillingly simple. Because everyone will be dead. He was emphatic. No first responders could even enter the affected zones for at least 72 hours because of the radiation.
72 hours. 3 days.
So his conclusion, for anyone who might survive the initial hit, was unequivocal. You're on your own.
You're on your own. Coming from the former head of FEMA.
It really drives home how different this is from any other disaster they plan for. Hurricanes, earthquakes, this is just off the scale. Fugate's advice for survivors, if you can call it that, was grim. Stock Pedialyte.
Pedialyte. For hydration, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Assuming you find clean water.
Right. And maybe even more tellingly, he said, don't forget your morals.
Stock Pedialyte and keep your morals. That level of stripped-down survival advice, it just underlines the utter hopelessness of the immediate aftermath. And this scenario, it starts with one missile, but the actual warfighting strategy, it assumes a much bigger attack, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The whole system, the strategy, it wasn't built for just 1 or 2 missiles getting through. Sources indicate that in a full-scale exchange, the assumption is that pretty much every major U.S. city, every airport, every industrial base would likely be targeted all at once.
Which brings us back to that agonizing decision, the ticking clock we mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
How long does the U.S. president actually have from the moment they detect an incoming ballistic missile to decide whether to launch a counterattack?
It's about 6 minutes.
6 minutes.
6 minutes, like making a pot of coffee, as Jacobsen puts it.
To decide the fate of potentially billions, why? Why so incredibly fast?
It's driven by this core strategic concept. Use them or lose them.
Yeah.
The entire system is predicated on the assumption of a massive, coordinated incoming attack, what they call the mother load.
Right, the big one.
Exactly. So to make sure U.S. missiles aren't destroyed in their silos before they can even launch, the president has to make the decision and initiate the launch before those incoming warheads actually land.
So if they wait too long, trying to confirm things or deliberate, their ability to retaliate might be gone.
Precisely. It forces this incredibly rapid decision under unimaginable pressure.
And once those missiles, the ICBMs, are launched, can they be stopped, recalled, redirected?
Absolutely not. That's a critical fact. Once ballistic missiles are out of the atmosphere, heading toward their targets, there's no calling them back. Jacobsen actually mentions how even President Reagan once mistakenly said they could be recalled. It shows how complex and maybe even misunderstood these systems are, even at the highest levels.
So no takebacks.
Yeah.
And all of this 6-minute race against annihilation, it's happening entirely in secret.
Yeah.
The public has no idea. Nobody outside that command chain knows anything until the missiles start landing.
A silent, terrifying countdown happening completely out of sight.
Okay, let's get into the actual mechanics. The systems involved in that decision during those critical 6 minutes. The famous football, what is it really? What's it do?
Right, the football. It's that emergency satchel, that leather briefcase that's always, always with the president, 24/7. Wherever the president goes, a military aide carrying that bag is right there. It's the constant physical link to the nuclear command system.
Jacobsen shared a story about that, right? From Lum Merletti, former Secret Service director.
Yeah, it really highlights its importance. Merletti talked about being with President Clinton in Syria. Syrian security tried to stop the military aide carrying the football from getting into an elevator with Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
Merletti basically said, absolutely not. It was a non-negotiable standoff. The aide had to be there. The football always stays with the president. No exceptions. That story really drives home just how critical and ever-present it is.
Okay, so it's always there. What's actually inside it? What tools does it give the president in that 6-minute window?
Well, primarily 2 key things. First, it contains the means for the president to authenticate their identity with the National Military Command Center, the NMCC, which is deep beneath the Pentagon.
So proving it's really them giving the order.
Exactly. That's the crucial first step. And second, it contains what's known informally as the Black Book.
The Black Book. And sources say it's called that because it involves so much death.
That's the grim nickname. Yeah. It's not like a book of strategy the president sits and reads through in the moment. It's basically a predetermined list of nuclear strike options. Some sources described it almost like looking at a Denny's menu of targets and scenarios.
A Denny's menu of death. That's a powerful, disturbing image.
It really underscores the lack of real-time decision-making about what specifically to hit. It's all pre-planned. The president chooses a predefined play from this book, like, say, Option Alpha 26.
Just picks a code.
Right. And when they choose that code, everyone down the command chain already knows exactly which targets are hit, how many warheads, the timing, the delivery systems, everything. There's simply no time in 6 minutes to start figuring out a new strategy or picking individual targets on the fly. It's all from a playbook designed for various levels of response.
So the president selects a prepackaged response. And where are the key nodes in this command system? Where do the orders go?
The sources point to 3 main command bunkers. There's the NMCC under the Pentagon, that's kind of the beating heart where identity is confirmed and the orders start.
Okay.
Then there's Cheyenne Mountain, the famous one you see in movies. That's NOAD, tracking incoming threats, sort of the brains.
Right.
And then there's Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. That's home to STRATCOM, Strategic Command.
STRATCOM. And that's where the order actually goes out for execution.
Yes, STRATCOM is the muzzle. The STRATCOM commander receives the validated launch order from the president and is responsible for directing the whole nuclear enterprise. That's about 150,000 people.
Wow. Missileers, bomber crews, submarines.
All of them. And apparently after receiving that order, the STRATCOM commander literally has to run out and jump onto the doomsday plane.
The airborne command post.
Right. It's a specially equipped aircraft designed to maintain command and control if the ground bunkers are destroyed or compromised.
So even in this high-tech system, you still have this image of a 4-star general running to catch a plane to manage Armageddon.
It highlights that mix, doesn't it? Rigid procedure, but still reliant on human actions. The whole process is described as very systematic, sequential, numerical. A follows B follows C. But there are still these chillingly human roles embedded in it. Sources mention that within the STRATCOM bunker, there's actually a weather officer.
A weather officer? Why?
Their job, believe it or not, is to be ready to brief the president if there's time, and if they're asked on the potential death tolls from radioactive fallout, based on the wind and weather patterns at that exact moment.
A weather forecast for death by radiation. That detail really brings home the human stakes inside this huge automated system.
It really does. And it also brings us to thinking about the inherent risks, the potential flaws that exist even within this incredibly refined practice system.
You mentioned earlier the system was really built for the motherlode, that massive attack. So what are the risks if it starts differently, like in Jacobsen's scenario, with just one rogue launch?
Well, that significantly increases the risk of miscommunication, miscalculation, just dangerous misinterpretation. One critical flaw that gets highlighted is geography. If the U.S. were to launch ICBMs at North Korea from silos in the central U.S., those missiles would inevitably have to fly over Russia to get there.
And given current tensions.
Exactly. Russia could easily see missiles flying over their territory and assume they are the target, especially given that their early warning systems might not be as robust as the U.S. ones.
Those systems aren't as advanced.
Well, experts who study Russian nuclear forces, like Pavel Podvig, say their Tundra satellite system, for instance, is known to have flaws. It can apparently misinterpret things like sunlight glinting off high-altitude clouds as a missile launch plume.
Seriously. Clouds could look like missiles.
It's a known vulnerability. The U.S. system is apparently much more precise in distinguishing these things. So you combine that technical vulnerability on Russia's side with deep geopolitical mistrust, and you get this terrifying possibility. A single U.S. missile aimed at North Korea could trigger Russia to launch their entire arsenal, their motherlode, in response.
So a technical glitch, a satellite misreading clouds, combined with mistrust, could accidentally trigger global nuclear war. That feels incredibly fragile.
It is, and we've seen real-world examples recently of how communication can just break down under pressure, even in less extreme situations. Remember during the war in Ukraine when there was that initial false report about a Russian missile hitting Poland?
Yeah, that was tense for a bit.
Well, General Mark Milley, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs, reportedly couldn't get through to his Russian counterpart for 36 hours.
36 hours?
Right.
In the middle of a crisis like that?
Exactly. Now imagine that kind of communication failure happening when missiles might actually be in the air, and that 6-minute clock is ticking down. It shows how easily things could spiral when clear communication is absolutely vital.
That lack of connection at a critical moment, It really underscores the danger. What about the human factors inside that tiny 6-minute window?
Well, the time pressure is just immense. There's virtually no time for depth strategic thinking or lengthy consultations with advisors. Ultimately, the decision rests almost entirely on the president's judgment, on their mental state, their cognition under the most extreme stress imaginable.
So the character, the temperament, the capabilities of whoever is in that office become absolutely critical.
Paramount in that 6-minute time frame, yes.
Which also brings up the question, could someone down the chain, like the STRATCOM commander receiving the order, could they refuse? Could they say no if they believe the order was catastrophic or maybe even unlawful?
That's a really heavy question, and the sources seem to offer conflicting views. Some people dismiss it as highly improbable, given the system, the training, the protocols. One person said it's easier to win the lottery.
Follow orders.
Essentially. But others grapple with the sheer moral weight of it. They suggest it would be almost impossible psychologically for a human being to actually give that final world-ending launch order, knowing the consequences, regardless of the training or the protocol.
So we don't really know.
It remains this deeply unsettling, kind of open question about human agency versus the momentum of the system. An impossible burden on one person.
An impossible burden. Okay, let's look a bit further down the timeline. Let's say the launch sequence is initiated. What about interception? Can the U.S. shoot down incoming ballistic missiles?
The capabilities there are surprisingly limited, according to the sources. The main system for intercepting ICBMs is the Ground-Based Midcourse Defense, or GMD. The U.S. has a total of 44 interceptors.
Only 44. Against potentially hundreds or even thousands of incoming warheads in a motherlode scenario.
Exactly. 40 are based in Alaska, 4 in California, and their reported success rate in tests is only around 50%.
50%.
Yeah.
So half might miss. And you only have 44 shots anyway.
Right. They're designed to hit missiles during their mid-course phase when they're coasting through space, about 9 minutes into flight. But the program is reportedly on a kind of strategic pause right now because they haven't figured out how to make it significantly more effective against a large, sophisticated attack with decoys and countermeasures.
What about other systems we hear about, like FOD or the missiles on Navy ships?
Those systems like FOD, or the ship-based Aegis system with its SM-3 missiles, they're designed for different threats. Shorter-range rockets, tactical ballistic missiles, or maybe intercepting a missile in its initial boost phase, closer to the launch point.
So not for ICBMs coming over the pole?
Generally, no. They're usually deployed overseas or at sea to protect specific regions or forces. They are not designed to, and realistically cannot, shoot down a massive simultaneous volley of ICBMs heading for the U.S. homeland.
So the idea of some kind of Star Wars missile shield protecting the whole country, based on these sources, that's just not the reality.
Not against a full-scale attack, no.
Which means we have to confront the aftermath. If deterrence fails, if the missiles land, what does the planet look like? Year 1, year 2, beyond. What happens to any survivors?
This is where the nuclear winter projections become absolutely terrifying. The massive fires ignited by the blasts, those megafires burning cities, forests, they would inject enormous amounts of soot and smoke high into the stratosphere.
When that blocks the sun, right?
Exactly. This thick layer of soot would block sunlight from reaching the surface globally, temperatures would plummet, growing seasons would vanish. It's a global nuclear winter.
Freezing darkness covering the planet.
For potentially years. And then, when the sun does eventually start to break through again, the ozone layer would likely be severely damaged or even destroyed by all the chemical reactions caused by the blasts in the atmosphere.
So when the light returns, it's lethal.
Yes. Sunlight itself would cause severe radiation poisoning because the protective ozone layer is gone.
So you go from freezing darkness to deadly sunshine. Survival sounds impossible.
It would necessitate living underground for extended periods, maybe years, in whatever makeshift or existing shelters people could find or create. And resources, food, clean water, medical supplies, even breathable air filters would become incredibly scarce, almost immediately.
It sounds like society just collapses. A return to something primitive.
Sources describe exactly that, a brutal fight for food and water scenario. All the complex systems we rely on, supply chains, power grids, the internet, communication networks, gone. Annihilated.
And what about biological threats in that kind of environment?
That's another horrific dimension mentioned. Small-bodied animals, especially insects, tend to reproduce much faster than humans and are often more resistant to radiation and drastic environmental changes.
Oh, plagues.
Potentially plagues, yes. Rapid spread of pathogens carried by insects. Major ecological imbalances. And on top of that, you have the billions of bodies from the initial attacks and the immediate aftermath, eventually thawing, adding to disease vectors and just the sheer horror of the landscape.
Professor Brian Toon, one of the scientists who originally developed the nuclear winter theory, he compared this to the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, didn't he?
He did. The Chicxulub impact event wiped out about 70% of species on Earth. A full-scale nuclear exchange could potentially cause a similar, maybe even greater, collapse of the biosphere and certainly of human civilization.
So it's not just nation-ending. It's civilization-ending.
That's the potential scale, reducing humanity, if it survived at all, back to a hunter-gatherer existence. It echoes that famous chilling quote often attributed to Einstein. He didn't know what weapons World War III would be fought with, but World War II would be fought with sticks and stones.
A complete reset, wiping out millennia of progress in just days or weeks. It really paints a picture of utter, complete devastation.
It forces you to confront the profound fragility of, well, everything we take for granted.
And it leads to some broader, maybe more philosophical questions that Jacobsen's work touches on. Like, why? Why does a system even exist that holds this potential for self-annihilation?
That is the core paradox, isn't it? The stated reason is always safety. Deterrence. We need nuclear weapons because the other guys have them.
Right. Mutually assured destruction, keeping the peace.
In theory. It's meant to prevent war by making the cost unimaginably high, but it creates this inherent catch-22 conundrum, as some sources put it. You feel compelled to build more weapons, more sophisticated systems, because the other side is doing it, all supposedly to prevent their use.
So deterrence is entirely theoretical. It just relies on the hope, the assumption that it will hold.
Yeah.
That nobody will ever actually push the button.
Exactly. And people familiar with strategic war games point out that if deterrence does fail, there's almost no mechanism built in to stop the escalation. The system, as it's designed, tends to flow towards a full exchange, towards Armageddon. There's no easy off-ramp once that sequence begins.
It makes me think of that anecdote from Paul Nitze, the defense official who became a big arms control advocate later in life. He called the arms race apes on a treadmill.
That's such a vivid metaphor. He saw both sides, the U.S., the Soviet Union, just slavishly running, building more and more, spending incredible resources, but not actually getting anywhere safer.
Just running because the other ape is running.
Precisely. He apparently used to tell the story about an experiment where an ape, just tired of being on this pointless treadmill, looked around, saw a button, pushed it, and got off. And Nitze would ask, why can't humans, with all our supposed intelligence and consciousness, do the same? Why can't we figure out how to get off this self-destructive treadmill?
Apes figure out how to stop the madness, but we're still running. It really makes you question our collective rationality, or maybe just the overwhelming power of fear and mistrust. It also brings up this related idea that Jacobsen explores in her other work about how much knowledge is hidden or misunderstood or even deliberately obscured from us.
Yes, she definitely touches on that. The idea that there might be aspects of human history, human capabilities that we're only just starting to grasp, or maybe that have been forgotten. She references things like ancient archaeological sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, or these rumored deep underground cities also found there.
How does that connect?
Well, you could see them as potential examples of humanity doing extraordinary, maybe even hidden things in the distant past, perhaps relevant if you consider the need to survive underground in a post-nuclear world. It hints at capabilities or histories we don't fully understand.
And she also delves into the world of intelligence agencies, strategic deception, which feels very connected to that idea of hidden information and maybe manufactured reality.
Absolutely. She discusses how intelligence agencies, specifically the CIA in her examples, historically used emerging phenomena like the UFO mythology in the mid-20th century as a kind of cover.
Cover for what?
For their own top-secret aerial reconnaissance programs. When people saw extremely advanced aircraft like the U-2 spy plane or the later A-12 Oxcart flying at speeds and altitudes previously thought impossible,
they reported them as UFOs.
Sometimes, yes. And according to Jacobsen's reporting, the CIA actively leveraged this. They let the UFO narrative flourish, even apparently coordinating with the FBI to have people who cited these secret planes sign non-disclosure agreements. It effectively used public belief in something else UFOs to protect the reality of their secret projects.
So the government was actively shaping public perception, blurring the lines between reality and myth, essentially, to hide its own capabilities.
That's the argument she presents, based on her sources. And she introduces a particularly, well, controversial source in this context, a man named Al O'Donnell.
Who was he?
Reportedly a nuclear weapons engineer with extremely high security clearances, and O'Donnell suggested something extraordinary about the famous Roswell incident. He claimed it involved surgically altered human beings created by Stalin's Soviet Union as a black propaganda hoax directed at the U.S.
Surgically altered humans.
Yeah.
As a hoax. To achieve what?
The alleged goal was to cause mass hysteria and panic in the United States, to overwhelm U.S. intelligence and defense systems with confusion and fear, distracting them with this bizarre manufactured crisis while maybe hiding other Soviet activities.
That sounds almost unbelievable, like something straight out of a wild spy novel.
Well, it does sound incredible, but Jacobsen frames it within the documented history of intelligence agencies, both the CIA and the KGB, engaging in incredibly elaborate, sometimes very strange strategic deception campaigns throughout the Cold War. O'Donnell, supposedly coming from deep inside the nuclear weapons complex, adds this unsettling layer of possibility about the extreme lengths agencies might go to.
And this connects back to that sociological concept, the Thomas theorem, right?
It's a perfect illustration of it, yes. The Thomas theorem basically states, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Meaning, it doesn't matter if something is objectively true or not. If people believe it's real, whether it's a threat, a rumor, a piece of misinformation, or a deliberate deception, like the one O'Donnell alleged their reactions, the panic, the societal impact, those consequences are absolutely real. Perceived reality creates actual consequences. And that's incredibly relevant when you think about a world of secret intelligence operations, potential deception, and the possibility of misinterpreting a signal with world-ending results.
So lies, mistakes, misperceptions, intentional or accidental, they can trigger very real, very physical, potentially catastrophic outcomes. And Jacobsen's work also touches on the different ways agencies like the CIA and the KGB operate. They're different rules.
Yes, she notes how the CIA operates under what's called Title 50 authority. This gives them broad latitude for covert actions overseas that the regular U.S. military might be prohibited from doing. It's described as essentially what the president wants, the president gets in terms of covert ops, like the raid that killed bin Laden in Pakistan, a country the U.S. wasn't officially at war with. And she also briefly mentions the KGB's historical methods, including their notorious use of specialized poison labs and targeted assassination techniques.
A whole hidden world of calculated secrecy, high-stakes operations, and unconventional warfare running in parallel to the terrifying conventional and nuclear forces we've been discussing. So, taking a step back after this incredibly intense exploration, the scenario, the systems, the risks, the horrific aftermath, the context of deception and human nature, why does drilling down into this terrifying detail matter to you, the listener, today?
Well, because it's not just some abstract theoretical exercise. Understanding the speed, the potential for system failure, the critical human element, it connects directly to the choices you make, particularly when it comes to who you empower to hold that ultimate authority in that 6-minute decision window.
You mean the character, the judgment, the cognition of the president in that impossible moment?
Exactly. This scenario, Jacobsen's whole exploration, throws into incredibly sharp relief just how paramount the individual capabilities, the temperament, the stability of the commander-in-chief really are. It highlights factors that maybe should be front and center when you're considering who to give that power to.
It definitely makes the choice of who occupies that office feel incredibly consequential, not just for policy decisions, but for fundamental survival.
And as the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, put it very chillingly, very succinctly, we are one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation.
One mistake away.
And the experts Jacobsen interviewed, they echo that. They call the current situation madness. They stress that we must come back from the brink because we're at the brink.
So having these conversations, gaining this understanding while we still can, that's essential.
Absolutely. Having these discussions, really trying to grasp the mechanics and the consequences while we still have the time and the relative calm to think clearly about it, seems crucial. It's true, we should acknowledge that despite the ever-increasing power of these weapons, the complexity of the systems, new threats like AI potentially entering the mix, we have managed to avoid a full-scale nuclear exchange for decades now. Maybe the sheer horror we've discussed has paradoxically helped prevent it. The goal, obviously, is to keep it that way. And understanding the risks, truly understanding them, feels like the necessary first step.
Yeah. This deep dive into the abyss, it's not about causing panic. It's about providing knowledge. And hopefully that knowledge is empowering. It informs our understanding of the world's really precarious balance and maybe our collective responsibility in trying to maintain that balance.
Well said. Ignorance really isn't a defense here.
Right. So let's try to sum up the key takeaways from this deep dive. We've explored the terrifying speed of a potential nuclear war unfolding in mere minutes, the almost unimaginable scale of destruction. Billions potentially dead, the planet itself fundamentally altered for years, maybe decades.
We looked at the inherent fragility, the risks lurking within these complex command and control systems, misinterpretation, technical glitches, communication breakdowns.
The immense, maybe impossible burden placed on human decision-makers, particularly the president, within that incredibly short time frame.
The shocking reality that there's really no effective defense against a large-scale ballistic missile attack. The shields we imagine just aren't there in the way we might think.
And finally, the horrific, almost primitive reality of the post-war world. Nuclear winter, lethal sunlight, societal collapse, a fight for basic survival.
And running through all the sources Jacobsen drew upon, the message seems crystal clear. Nuclear war cannot be won, and it must never, ever be fought. We are living on the brink, and we need to consciously, actively step back from it.
Which leaves us with maybe one final provocative thought to consider. Circling back to Paul Nitze and his apes on a treadmill. If simple apes, faced with a self-defeating, exhausting, pointless loop, can somehow observe their situation and figure out how to push the button and get off the treadmill, why do humans, with all our vaunted consciousness, our incredible intelligence, our vast knowledge, our technology capable of both creation and utter annihilation, why do we still seem to struggle so profoundly with this fundamental drive towards conflict, towards potential self-destruction? What does it actually take for us as a species to evolve beyond that? It's not just about preventing this one specific ultimate catastrophe, terrifying as it is. It's maybe about grappling with a really deep, challenging aspect of human nature itself and deciding what kind of future we truly want, or maybe what kind of future we're even capable of building.